What if the laws that shape our lives are not as permanent as we believe? It's a question most of us never think to ask. The ground feels solid beneath our feet. Time seems steady. Light behaves. Electricity obeys. And cause follows effect in a dependable rhythm. Our world appears stitched together by patterns that rarely, if ever, misbehave. And yet, scattered across the planet, there are places that hint at a quieter, stranger truth. Locations where the familiar scaffolding of physics bends, wavers, or briefly steps aside. Places where gravity doesn't fall the way it should, where clocks run at their own pace, where the air forgets how to carry a signal, or where light itself seems undecided about how fast it wishes to travel. Many of these sites were once written off as folklore, odd stories told by villagers, travelers, or workers who sensed something off but lacked the language to explain it. Others were catalogued privately, folded into academic notes or government archives, not suppressed out of conspiracy, but out of caution, a recognition that unexplained things often draw more noise than understanding. This documentary is not about secrets. It is about questions. Questions about how we know what we know. Questions about why we trust certain aspects of reality so completely. Questions about whether nature is as uniform as our textbooks pretend. Each of the stories ahead begins in a real landscape, a stretch of road, a forest clearing, a sealed laboratory, a distant desert. Yet each becomes something more than geography. These places invite us into moments where the world seems to hesitate, where its rules drift just slightly out of frame. They are less about the anomalies themselves and more about what stirs inside us when the familiar loosens its grip. Imagine standing on a hillside where a parked car begins to drift upward. Not rolling, not sliding, ascending as if nudged by an unseen hand. Imagine stepping into a circle of pine trees where your watch ticks more slowly, not by illusion, but by measurable, repeatable difference. Imagine holding a compass that refuses to point north, insisting instead on turning inward, as though something beneath your feet is calling it home. These moments are not spectacles, they are thresholds. Every culture throughout history has told stories about thresholds, thin places where the ordinary softens and something deeper shines through. In earlier centuries, these were framed as sacred sites or omens. Today we approach them through instruments, equations, and cautious field notes. But the emotional experience is the same: awe, uncertainty, a gentle unmooring, a reminder that the universe still contains a few untended corners. The temptation, of course, is to demand answers, to force the world to explain itself. But perhaps the more human approach, the more honest one, is to listen first, to consider that anomalies may not exist to be solved, but to expand the boundaries of our curiosity. They nudge us to remember that science began not with certainty, but with wonder. So this journey will follow a simple rhythm. We will meet a landscape, witness something there that resists easy explanation, and then pause, not to speculate wildly, but to reflect on what the moment tells us about being alive in a universe far more complex than our daily routines suggest. This is not a story about breaking physics. It is a story about discovering how much room remains within it. And so we begin, not with an explosion or revelation, but with a quiet road high in the mountains, a road where gravity seems to drift upward like a breath caught in the throat of the earth. A place where the world performs a subtle sleight of hand, inviting us to look closer, to lean in, and to wonder. If even gravity can hesitate, what else might be possible? It begins with a simple question, the kind that seems almost childish in its innocence. What if down isn't always down? High in a northern mountain range, far from the settlements that cling to the valleys below, a stretch of road bends gently between two ridgelines. There is nothing dramatic about it. No jagged cliffs, no mysterious stone formations, no ruins to spark legend. Yet anyone who stops a vehicle on this quiet slope we'll witness something that refuses to fit inside our assumptions. The car doesn't roll backward as expected. It doesn't even stay still. Instead, slowly, almost politely, it drifts up the incline. Not with the force of an engine, but with the subtle, persistent insistence of a world momentarily out of step with itself. Most travelers laugh the first time they see it. They assume it's an illusion, a trick of perspective born from uneven terrain or distant horizons that tilt the eye. And sometimes that explanation is enough. We are creatures wired to trust our senses even as we distrust them, holding these contradictions in our hands with surprising ease. But the locals who live nearest to this mountain road tell a different story. They recall winters when parked supply trucks inch uphill in freshly fallen snow, leaving crisp tracks behind them. They speak of the military convoy that once halted here, only to find its vehicles gently drifting against the grade, as though the earth were exhaling in the wrong direction. For many, the instinct is to chase the physics, to pull out levels, gyroscopes, accelerometers, to measure angles and run equations. And in truth, there is a certain beauty in that pursuit, a reminder that curiosity is our oldest companion. But numbers alone have never been the soul of this place. The real presence lies in the quiet pause it creates in the mind, a pause that opens a small, unlit doorway into a deeper awareness. What if the universe is not a machine, but a conversation? Standing on that road, you feel it, a subtle, uncanny dislocation, as if the world beneath your boots has loosened its grip just enough to whisper another possibility. Gravity, the invisible hand that anchors oceans and continents, behaves here like a guest rather than a host. Not broken, not reversed, simply rearranged, redirected, briefly willing to consider a different direction. Scientists have visited, of course. Their instruments describe slight variations that challenge the neat global uniformity we expect. They record readings that seem to tilt upward, defying the elegant simplicity of Newton's equations. Yet even their most careful reports end with the same quiet disclaimer: more study is needed, nothing is conclusive, much remains unknown. And perhaps that too is part of the story. Not every question must be answered immediately. Some landscapes offer insight not through certainty, but through the gentle experience of doubt. Imagine placing a stone on the asphalt, watching it tremble, then begin to slide uphill. The movement is so small, so subtle, that it almost feels like a trick your mind invented. But once you see it, you cannot unsee it. And once you accept that the world can behave this way, even for a moment, a new thought emerges. If the force we trust most, gravity, can express itself differently here, what else in our lives might be more flexible than we believe? This mountain road does not shatter the laws of physics. Instead, it invites us to reconsider the absolutes we cling to. It reminds us that reality is textured, layered, perhaps even playful. And in that realization, there is something profoundly human, a sense that the world still contains surprises, gentle enough to approach, yet deep enough to humble us. As we leave the slope behind, the wind changes direction, and the terrain resumes its familiar order. But the memory lingers, a small defiance of expectation, tucked away like a stone carried home in a pocket. Next, we travel from the mountains to a forest far to the north, where time itself seems to gather in slow, deliberate circles. It begins with something so ordinary that most people never notice it: a digital clock just slightly out of sync. Not flashing, not broken, simply lagging behind its neighbors by a few seconds. That's all it took for a team of researchers to step into a quiet patch of northern forest and realize that time, the most dependable rhythm we know, can stumble. The clearing itself is unremarkable. A ring of pines, a patch of soft undergrowth, a stillness broken only by the wind threading through needles overhead. Yet step a few meters inward, and atomic clocks, devices engineered to be among the most precise tools humans have ever built, begin to drift, not wildly, not chaotically, but consistently, predictably, as though this small circle of Earth has decided to keep its own tempo. Imagine holding two identical timepieces, synchronized to the same universal pulse, and watching them diverge slowly, like siblings choosing different paths. One marches to the world's cadence, the other seems to exhale, lengthening each second just slightly. It is not enough to feel with the body. No human nervous system is tuned finely enough to notice milliseconds slipping away. But the instruments do not lie. They whisper a story of subtle divergence, a gentle bending of the temporal frame. Local botanists noticed it long before physicists arrived. Growth rings in trees near the heart of the clearing seemed oddly spaced, as if the forest had lived through seasons the surrounding landscape had not. Leaves sprouted earlier here, and soil organisms aged strangely, as though wrapped in a different rhythm of decay and renewal. To walk through these woods is to sense not a rupture in reality, but a different pacing to its breath. Standing at the boundary, the transition is stark. One step, and your equipment remains faithful to global time. Another, and it drifts, not by chance, but by rule. To researchers, this sharp line is more provocative than the anomaly itself. Nature rarely draws straight edges. Gradients, transitions, softening contours, yes. But an invisible threshold where time behaves one way on one side and another way just inches beyond. That suggests intention, or at least structure, woven into the world in ways we do not yet understand. And yet, for all the technical intrigue, the emotional experience of the place is far gentler. People who spend time here describe an odd sense of calm, as if their thoughts unspool a bit more slowly. Hikers say the forest feels deeper than it should, that silence lingers a little longer between footfalls. It isn't mystical, it's atmospheric, a subtle persuasion of the senses. Whether these impressions arise from physics or psychology hardly matters. The forest teaches its lesson either way. We like to think of time as linear, a river we float along without choice at a speed no one can alter. But the natural world quietly disagrees. Seasons ebb unevenly, tectonic plates drift in fits, stars pulse on cycles so vast they defy imagination. And here, in this small northern grove, time seems content to express its variability in a way we can measure, if not entirely fathom. Perhaps the most profound question this forest raises is not why time slows here, but what it means that it can. If time is not uniform across all places, then our memories, our aging, our sense of past and future, all of these might be more flexible than we imagine. We are not passengers on a fixed conveyor belt. We are participants in a universe whose rhythms may be richer and more diverse than any equation can fully capture. When the team leaves the clearing, their clocks resynchronize with the world, as if nothing unusual has occurred. But something has changed, not in the devices, but in the people carrying them. They have seen the river of time eddy, swirl, pause. They have learned that even the most universal constant carries its own quiet variations. Ahead lies a landscape where variation takes on a different form, a place where the world does not slow, but falls silent in a frequency we rely on every day. There is a stretch of land in the deep interior of a sun-bleached continent where silence takes on a different meaning. Not the silence of meditation or wilderness, where sound softens into background hush. This silence is sharper, more absolute, as if the air itself has forgotten how to carry the signals that knit our modern world together. Travelers who approach the region often notice the first sign unintentionally: a phone that refuses to find a signal, a GPS unit that won't lock onto satellites, a radio that collapses into static before falling mute altogether. At first, these failures seem like the familiar inconveniences of remote terrain. But within a certain boundary, something more unsettling occurs. Devices don't simply weaken, they stop completely. as though the invisible threads of electromagnetism have been cleanly severed. It is a strange sensation to stand inside a place where no electronic device functions. A flashlight's bulb does not glow. A simple digital watch freezes, its quartz oscillator struck still. Even battery-powered tools, those that should be self-contained, fall quiet. In this region, technology cannot follow you in. It must wait at the edge like a loyal companion, barred from crossing a threshold it does not understand. Scientists once tried to map the boundary, expecting a gradient or soft drop-off. Instead, they found something remarkably crisp. Step 1 foot past a certain line in the dust, and the world of circuits and signals simply falls away. Step back, and everything hums to life again. To walk this line is to feel you are straddling two different realities, each governed by its own unspoken rules. One might expect darkness inside such a place, a visual emptiness corresponding to the electronic void. But the opposite is true. Light moves freely here. The horizon glows with the same sun, the same sky. Shadows form normally. The human eye, unaided and analog, perceives nothing unusual. The world looks whole even as its unseen layers unravel. This contradiction unsettles researchers more than the silence itself. Light is an electromagnetic wave, yet it travels unimpeded while radio waves die instantly. It is as though the land has chosen a specific portion of the electromagnetic spectrum to erase, leaving the rest untouched. Nature rarely edits itself with such precision, and when it does, it raises questions no instrument can answer cleanly. People who spend time in this place describe a peculiar sensation, not fear exactly, but a heightened awareness of their own bodies. Without signals around us, without the soft background buzz of our technological environment, we realize how much we lean on invisible architecture every moment of our lives. Here, stripped of that scaffolding, a person feels more solitary, more tactilely human. The world becomes immediate again. The crunch of soil, the rhythm of breath, the warmth of sunlight on skin. Some researchers say the zone feels like an echo of an earlier planet, a world before antennae pierced the skyline and satellites mapped the continents. Others feel it reveals something deeper, not a past we left behind, but a reminder of how much of our perception is shaped by waves our bodies cannot sense. When those waves vanish, we encounter ourselves more directly. Standing at the center of this silent region, one cannot help but wonder whether our dependence on connectivity has made us forget how to listen, not to devices, but to presence. Here, surrounded by desert wind and an impossible quiet, it becomes clear that silence is not empty. It is a space in which new questions can form, and with that awareness we step toward the next anomaly, a place where guidance falters not because signals vanish, but because direction itself seems to fold inward. Every traveler knows the quiet trust we place in direction. Whether we hold a compass in the palm of a hand or follow an internal sense of where home lies, orientation is one of the most fundamental human instincts. To lose it is unsettling, but to watch it turn against expectation, to see the needle you've trusted your whole life pivot toward some impossible center is something else entirely. The room where this happens is unremarkable at first glance. A square chamber beneath a research complex, outfitted with the typical instruments of experimental science, metal tables, mounted sensors, a scattering of notebooks and consoles. If anything, the space feels almost disappointingly ordinary. But the moment a compass enters, the illusion falls apart. Instead of aligning with Earth's magnetic field, the needle begins to wobble, stutter, and then settle in a direction that defies every navigational chart, pointing not north but inward toward the center of the room. Even more unsettling, every compass, no matter where it is placed, points to the same invisible point. It is as though the room has grown a magnetic heart. Researchers tried to trace the cause. They dismantled equipment, searched for stray magnets, recalibrated sensors, even stripped the walls down to bare material. Nothing explained it. The magnetic field inside the chamber behaved like a riddle, coherent, consistent, and entirely out of step with how magnetism is supposed to work. Perhaps the strangest aspect is that the field appears to have no source. Magnetic fields are not free-floating phenomena. They emerge from physical objects, from aligned domains, from measurable currents. But here, the field behaves as if it exists independently, an invisible architecture with no foundation. It converges toward a single point in space, obeying rules that cannot be traced back to any physical object. Remove everything from the room, and the effect remains. Those who've worked in the chamber describe an uncanny stillness, not because the air is quiet, but because their instruments seem to have developed a mind of their own. Metal tools drift subtly across tables toward the room's center. Loose screws roll inward. Even a small pendant on a chain will tilt ever so slightly in the same direction, as if responding to a gravity that doesn't exist. But beyond the technical mystery lies a deeper, more personal disquiet. We trust direction as a metaphor for our lives, finding your path, staying the course, following your compass. These phrases are built on the belief that orientation is stable, fixed, reliable. But in this chamber, direction becomes an open question. North is no longer north. The map is no longer sovereign. The needle points inward, and in doing so, it reflects something unexpectedly human. Because there are moments in a person's life when the outer world offers no reliable guidance, when traditions, expectations, and even common sense point in contradictory directions. In those moments, people sometimes speak of turning inward, not in retreat, but in recognition that the deeper coordinates lie within themselves. Standing in the chamber, watching all directions bend toward one point, it's hard not to feel as if the room is offering a quiet metaphor, a reminder that the world outside can shift unexpectedly, but orientation is still possible, just rooted in a different place. Researchers eventually sealed the chamber, not out of fear, but out of respect. It remains a rare place where the physical world mirrors an emotional truth. Sometimes the only way to navigate is to look inward. From here, our journey moves to a former mine far below the surface, where weight itself becomes a negotiable concept and matter behaves with unexpected grace. The descent begins through an old mine shaft, rusted rails, dripping stone, the echo of footsteps swallowed by narrow walls. There is nothing mystical in the approach, nothing to suggest that the space below behaves any differently from the world above. Yet once you reach the chamber, a wide cavern carved long ago by human effort, the air feels subtly expectant, as if it knows something you don't. At first, everything appears normal. Lanterns glow, dust motes drift lazily. Tools lie scattered on makeshift tables. But then, someone lifts a piece of equipment, perhaps a metal drill head or a block of stone, and the illusion falls away. Down here, weight is not a constant. It behaves like a tide. Objects near the floor feel strangely light, as though gravity is taking a moment to loosen its grip. A 40-pound crate can be hoisted as easily as a bedside lamp. But raise that same crate toward the ceiling and its weight grows steadily, insistently, until the person holding it feels their muscles strain against a burden that suddenly exceeds their strength. No trickery, no pulleys, no shifting leverage, only genuine, measurable changes in mass. Scientists who later investigated found that the phenomenon follows no conventional pattern. Gravity itself does not appear to fluctuate. Rather, the mass of objects varies with height. Matter grows denser as it rises, less dense as it descends. Like a whisper from some alternate version of physics, the chamber offers a glimpse of a world where mass is not fixed, but relational. Water shows the effect most dramatically. Samples taken near the floor behave with unusual lightness, swirling quicker, vaporizing faster, as though loosened from their own molecules. But raise a vial toward the ceiling, and the liquid thickens, becoming almost syrup-like. It pours reluctantly, its density shifting as if responding to an unseen gradient. Even temperature changes subtly, mirroring the liquid's altered properties. Standing in this space, one begins to understand why the miners who first reported the anomaly felt unnerved. When the basic rules of weight falter, everything else feels uncertain. Balance shifts unpredictably. Tools tip over without warning. A wooden beam that once sat firmly in place suddenly groans under an invisible load. Even one's body feels subtly different. Lighter steps near the floor, heavier breaths as you look upward. And yet, beyond the bewilderment, the chamber evokes a strange sense of empathy. It mirrors something deeply human, the way we carry our burdens, how some days feel inexplicably heavier, while others grant us a grace that makes even the difficult seem manageable. How the same experience can weigh differently depending on where we stand, what we face, and how we lift. In this chamber, physics imitates emotion. A person may lower an object and feel it lighten in their hands, a physical echo of relief. Or they may raise it and be reminded that rising, in any sense, often demands more strength than we expect. Researchers remain careful with their conclusions. Instruments detect no unusual minerals in the rock, no gravitational anomalies, no magnetic interference. The mass variation occurs within sharply defined boundaries, as though the chamber obeys a rule that exists nowhere else. A localized exception, a pocket of renegotiated reality. Eventually, the scientists sealed the space, not simply to protect it, but to preserve the questions it raised. Because the chamber does not teach us how matter works, it teaches us how little we understand. It suggests that the world we know may be only one version of what nature permits, a reminder that even the laws we consider absolute may contain chapters we haven't yet learned to read. Leaving the depths behind, we rise toward open sky, toward a desert where time misbehaves once again, not by slowing or stretching, but by reversing the order of cause and effect. The desert has always been a place where time feels different. Days stretch wide, nights collapse into crystalline silence. But there is a particular stretch of sand and stone, remote, windswept, unmarked on public maps, where time does not simply feel unusual. It behaves in ways that unsettle even the most seasoned observers. At first glance, nothing distinguishes this patch of earth from the miles surrounding it. The sun hangs the same. The dunes ripple in identical patterns, but cross an invisible threshold, and the ordinary logic of cause and effect begins to soften, then gently, impossibly invert. The first documented moment was almost mundane. A researcher heard the sound of a metal tool clatter to the ground, a heartbeat before he dropped it. His mind tried to correct the sequence automatically. Surely he had misremembered, or the wind had played a trick on his hearing. But then it happened again, and again, until the pattern became undeniable. In this place, effects sometimes arrive before their causes. Recordings later captured more startling examples. A camera showed dust rising in a brief plume just before a testing charge detonated. A light switched on moments before a researcher's hand touched the switch. A small rock tumbled down a slope, landing at the base before its descent had even begun. None of these events were dramatic. That was perhaps the most disquieting part. The reversals were subtle, quiet, almost polite, brief moments where reality seemed to get ahead of itself, as if reading from a script a few lines early. Scientists attempted to understand the phenomenon with the tools available to them: high-speed imaging, acoustic analysis, careful mapping of the zone's boundaries. They discovered that the spatial limits of the effect were precise, measured in meters, not miles. Step outside, and the world behaves normally. Step inside, and the puzzle begins anew. More intriguing still, the reversals never extended far into the future. The offsets were small, averaging a few seconds. It was as though the universe permitted only the slightest misalignment, a barely perceptible overlap between what is about to occur and what is already in motion. But even this subtle distortion was enough to challenge foundational assumptions about time, causality, and choice. People who spent long days in the zone described a psychological effect that was difficult to articulate. They often sensed a faint tug, a feeling that their actions were responding to outcomes rather than producing them. One researcher said it felt like walking through a conversation in which the replies occasionally arrived before the questions. Another claimed he felt certain thoughts forming in his mind a moment after he had already acted on them. The human mind craves narrative order. We expect beginnings to precede middles and middles to precede endings. When that sequence unravels, even slightly, a deeper unease emerges, the fear that our decisions may not be as sovereign as we imagine. If effects can appear before causes, then what becomes of intention? What becomes of responsibility? What becomes of choice? But perhaps the zone offers a gentler interpretation, not that the future dictates the past, but that time, like gravity, like magnetism, is more elastic than we assume. That causality is less a rigid chain and more a conversation shaped by context, by perspective, by the subtle ways events influence one another across moments we cannot fully see. Standing in the desert's quiet expanse, watching the late sun cast long shadows that seem to reach backward as much as forward, one begins to understand that time may not be a single arrow at all. It may be a field, a landscape in which we move, sometimes aware of what lies ahead, sometimes guided by echoes we only later understand. As we leave the anomalous zone, stepping back into the familiar comfort of cause following effect, the world feels steadier, yet the memory lingers, the faint sound of a future moment brushing lightly against the present. Our next destination takes the puzzle a step further, into a laboratory where even the speed of light, the ultimate cosmic constant, reveals itself to be more flexible than we ever imagined. Deep beneath a mountain range, past security doors and echoing corridors, lies a laboratory built not to discover new laws of physics, but to test the precision of the laws we thought we had already mastered. Yet in one particular chamber, a long cylindrical room lined with mirrors, optics, and vacuum equipment, the universe chose to reveal an unexpected footnote, that even light, the great constant of modern physics, may have its moments of hesitation and haste. Researchers first noticed something unusual during a simple calibration routine. Two beams, one red, one blue, were sent across identical distances to test timing equipment. Under normal conditions, photons of all colors travel at the same speed in a vacuum, a principle so fundamental that we use it to define the meter itself, but this time the beams arrived at slightly different moments. Red light finished its journey faster than expected. Blue light lagged behind. At first, the team assumed equipment failure. They checked cables, recalibrated sensors, replaced oscilloscopes, vacuum-sealed the chamber again. But the discrepancy remained. Then they repeated the experiment at different angles, and the results shifted again, not randomly, but consistently, depending on direction. Light traveling north to south moved measurably faster than light traveling east to west, as though space itself had developed preferences. What stunned the researchers wasn't only the variation, but the stability of it. The differences weren't flickers of noise or errors in measurement. They were patterns, repeatable, predictable, almost orderly. If the chamber had shattered our understanding of light entirely, perhaps disbelief would have been easier. But instead, it offered something subtler, a world where the constants we trust most behave more like guidelines, firm, dependable, and yet capable of bending under conditions we do not fully comprehend. Inside the chamber, the experience is not dramatic. There are no flashes, no distortions, no strange glows. The beams themselves look perfectly ordinary, thin threads of color stretched across a darkened space. Yet every pulse, every nanosecond of their travel whispers a quiet contradiction to Einstein's elegant limit. Some measurements even suggest that certain wavelengths complete their journey just before the equipment records their departure, hinting at temporal oddities that echo the desert phenomenon we encountered earlier. But here, the effect is contained, not a reversal of cause and effect, but a soft blurring at the edges of time's precision. Engineers describe an odd sensation working in this chamber. Not danger, not awe, something closer to humility. To stand in a room where light, the fastest traveler the universe allows, behaves differently depending on its direction, is to realize how much of our worldview rests on ideas we treat as unshakable. Constants that may only be constant from a certain vantage point. In the quiet moments after experiments conclude, when the machinery winds down and the chamber falls still, some researchers linger. They describe feeling as though the room is revealing a hidden texture, not of light, but of space itself. A suggestion that the fabric of reality has currents, eddies, or subtleties we've never known how to measure. There is a human echo in this discovery. We often speak of seeing the light as a metaphor for clarity. But what if clarity itself is directional? What if insight travels differently depending on where we are facing, what we are prepared to perceive, or which path we choose to follow? The chamber offers no answers, only the quiet reminder that even the fastest truths may bend when they move through the world, and that sometimes understanding does not come from chasing the speed of light, but from standing still long enough to watch how it moves. Ahead lies a place even stranger, a chamber where the smallest building blocks of reality refuse to settle into single states, holding multiple possibilities long past when theory says they should collapse. To enter this chamber is to step into a contradiction, a place engineered to eliminate noise, vibration, heat, and even the faint electromagnetic murmurs that drift through the world unnoticed. It was built as the quietest room on Earth, a sanctuary for quantum experiments that typically collapse under the slightest interference. And yet, in removing the world from the equation, researchers discovered something astonishing. The quantum behaved too well. Under normal conditions, the delicate states that govern particles at the smallest scales degrade almost instantly. A stray photon, a thermal fluctuation, even the presence of a measuring instrument can nudge a particle out of superposition, the strange condition in which it occupies multiple states at once. But here, in this engineered stillness, the particles refused to collapse. They clung to their overlapping possibilities like threads woven into a fabric beyond our understanding. The effect was not subtle. At first, researchers observed electrons maintaining uncertain positions far longer than theory predicted. Then atoms. Then structures built from millions, even billions of particles. Superposition, usually a fleeting whisper, became a lingering note. Reality hesitated, holding its breath. Experiments grew bolder. Crystalline lattices were placed within the chamber and cooled to near absolute zero. Instead of settling into predictable arrangements, they displayed patterns that existed in multiple configurations simultaneously. Snapshots taken at different intervals contradicted each other, as if the material had not yet chosen which version of itself to become. The most unsettling results came from biological samples. Proteins and cellular structures exhibited behaviors that hinted at prolonged quantum coherence, a level of organization that, in normal environments, is drowned out by the riot of molecular motion. Some researchers wondered quietly, almost reluctantly, whether the chamber was revealing something fundamental about life itself, that perhaps consciousness, memory, or thought involves quantum processes usually buried beneath noise. To enter the chamber is an eerie experience. It is not dark, but the light feels strangely clarified, as though every photon moves with purpose. There is no sound except your own breath, amplified in the absence of echoes. Instruments left running seem oddly hesitant, their readings stabilizing in ways that hint at a world holding 2 or 3 possibilities at once. Observers sometimes describe a peculiar emotional effect, a sense of openness or indecision, as if the mind briefly mirrors the superpositions around it. One scientist wrote that she felt unanchored, suspended between thoughts, as though the room invited multiple interpretations of the same moment. But for all its strangeness, the chamber also offers a profound insight. We often imagine reality as something crisp and definite, a world where events unfold one way and not another, where decisions lead to clear outcomes, where ambiguity is resolved as quickly as it appears. Yet at the deepest level, the universe embraces uncertainty. It thrives in it. Possibility is not an exception. It is the foundation. In this chamber, the boundary between potential and actuality stretches, revealing the scaffolding beneath our everyday experience. Not to frighten, but to remind us that the world is built of choices, not only ours, but nature's. And those choices need not happen instantly. They can linger, evolve, and refine themselves before taking form. Eventually, the experiments concluded, and the chamber was sealed, not because it was dangerous, but because its implications were too vast to fully chart. It remains a silent monument to the idea that what we call reality is, in many ways, a negotiation between what could be and what is. From here, our path leads to a place where negotiation takes on a different meaning. A laboratory where entropy, the great measure of disorder, seems to run in reverse, offering a glimpse of systems that grow more organized with time rather than less. There is a room hidden beneath one of the driest deserts in the world, a place defined not by its isolation, but by the peculiar way life and matter behave inside it. Walk through its doorway, and the first sensation is ordinary enough: the faint hum of ventilation, the sterile brightness of fluorescent lights. But linger a moment longer, and you begin to notice what should be impossible. Heat, for instance, moves the wrong way. A metal plate resting on a cool surface grows warmer, not colder. Two containers of liquid with identical temperatures diverge mysteriously, one heating, one chilling, as though pulled apart by an invisible gradient. In ordinary conditions, nature strives toward disorder. Energy disperses. Systems drift toward equilibrium. But here, the universe seems to practice the reverse, coaxing systems into increasing order, arranging molecules with careful intention. Researchers discovered this phenomenon almost accidentally. A closed-system experiment designed to track temperature changes began drifting in the opposite direction from what the equations predicted. Rather than relaxing into randomness, the system sharpened, organized itself, and produced measurable work without any added energy. At first, the data was dismissed as instrument error, then as an anomaly, then as a breakthrough. But eventually it was recognized as something far stranger, a localized pocket where the second law of thermodynamics, a principle so foundational that entire worlds depend on it, seemed to be rewritten. One of the most astonishing observations was biological. Cell cultures placed inside the room aged more slowly. Their internal structures became more orderly. Patterns of decay, typically steady and inevitable, softened into something that resembled renewal. Scientists reported that mitochondria, the engines of cells, functioned with unusual efficiency, as though benefiting from an environment that lifted some quiet burden from their processes. But the effect was not miraculous. It was subtle, almost respectful. Nothing within the room defied mortality. Rather, life seemed to breathe a little easier, as if the world had temporarily granted it permission to move uphill against entropy's familiar slope. The philosophical implications did not go unnoticed. Thermodynamics is more than a scientific framework. It is a metaphor woven through human experience. We often speak of burnout, disorder, and decline as natural progressions, the emotional equivalent of heat dissipating into space. But in this desert laboratory, the opposite occurs. Energy gathers, structure strengthens, order rises without being forced. It is a reminder that not all systems deteriorate. Some, under the right conditions, quietly improve. Standing inside the room, researchers describe an atmosphere unlike any other lab. Papers left on tables remain in unnaturally neat stacks. Dust settles in symmetrical patterns. Ice melts into sharper crystalline forms. Even sound behaves oddly, carrying with a clarity that suggests less interference, less chaos in the air itself. Yet despite its quiet wonders, the room also evokes caution. If entropy could reverse even locally, what would that mean for ecosystems, for machines, for the deep balance that governs everything from star formation to the beating of a human heart? Science advances not by ignoring such questions, but by acknowledging their weight. Perhaps the most profound aspect of this laboratory is not the data it collects, but the idea it represents. That order is not merely resistance against the universe's drift into disorder, but a natural possibility waiting for the right environment. A reminder that organization, in matter, in life, in thought, is not always a struggle. Sometimes it is an invitation. As we leave the desert complex, the heat of the surface world feels familiar again, almost grounding. But the memory of the chamber lingers, a place where time's arrow briefly curls back toward its own tail, revealing a softer, more hopeful gradient. Ahead lies a region where the anomalies become less predictable, where the very constants of nature fluctuate, as though the universe is experimenting with itself. There is a stretch of land, its coordinates quietly omitted from official charts, where the world seems unable to decide what version of itself to be. Satellites passing overhead have recorded subtle distortions, small but unmistakable signs that something beneath the surface behaves as though the rules governing it are still being negotiated. Researchers call it a field of instability, though the word field hardly captures its nature. It feels less like a location and more like a mood in the landscape, a place where reality wavers between possibilities. The anomaly first revealed itself through instruments, not human senses. Gravitational readings fluctuated by fractions, then by whole numbers. The speed of light, typically unwavering, shifted slightly from measurement to measurement. Even particle masses, so fundamental that all matter depends on their reliability, appeared to drift as though the universe were adjusting its settings. This variability didn't resemble chaos. It followed no erratic pattern. Instead, it moved like weather, changing, returning, stabilizing, then drifting again. A rhythm no algorithm could fully predict, but one that felt strangely organic. Walk into the region and you would notice nothing at first. The air carries no charge. The ground feels solid. Yet instruments betray a different truth. Drop a ball, and its acceleration varies depending on where you stand. Chemical reactions take longer in some spots than others, as if molecules are considering their next moves. Even electronics behave as though confused. Processors slow, clocks desynchronize, screens distort before clearing again. But the most haunting effect is the impact on perception. Researchers working within the zone describe moments of disorientation, brief but distinct. Colors seem to shift in tone, as if the visible spectrum itself breathes differently. Sounds change timbre, growing hollow or sharp without moving their source. Distances feel subtly wrong. Objects appear closer, then farther away, as if space is pulsing. One scientist famously remarked, "It feels like the world is exhaling in different units." Another compared it, Pushiat, to walking inside a thought the universe hasn't finished forming. What unnerves many is not the scientific challenge, but the philosophical one. We often think of physical constants as the universe's signature, unchanging, universal, the deep grammar that makes stars burn and atoms bind. To see them shift, even locally, is to glimpse a version of reality in which the universe is not a stable text, but an ongoing conversation. There are human parallels to this instability. Our lives, too, contain zones where constants falter, moments when identity shifts, relationships fluctuate, or the rules we rely on feel temporarily suspended. Times when the self is not quite settled, when experience reshapes us faster than we can articulate. Instability, in both physics and life, may not always signal danger. Sometimes it signals growth. The team monitoring the field has learned to treat it not as an aberration, but as an insight. A reminder that the laws we follow are not commandments etched in cosmic stone, but agreements that hold true until something, scale, energy, environment, invites a variation. Nature has room for exceptions, and perhaps we should too. Standing at the boundary of this anomalous zone, watching the land ahead shimmer almost imperceptibly in the heat, one feels a strange gratitude, not for the distortion itself, but for what it reveals. That certainty is a luxury, not a guarantee. And that stability, even in the universe at large, may be less a fact than a condition, one that can stretch, flex, and occasionally falter. As we step back into the familiar comfort of stable constants, we move toward a broader reflection. How knowledge is curated, how mysteries are framed, and how entire geographies of understanding can be misplaced, not by accident, but by design. Some mysteries fade because they are solved, others fade because they are forgotten. But a select few slip into a different kind of disappearance, not erased, but quietly omitted, tucked into margins where only the most persistent eyes still search. This is the territory of missing coordinates, the silent spaces on our maps where uncertainty is not an oversight, but a kind of stewardship. Throughout history, humankind has charted the world with remarkable confidence. Mountains, rivers, trade routes, even the shifting lines of political borders, all captured, catalogued, pinned in place with ink. But our maps are more than records of geography. They are declarations of what we believe to be known. And just as importantly, they are admissions of what we choose not to display. The anomalies we've encountered on this journey, the road that lifts upward, the forest where time slips, the chamber where light hesitates, rarely appear in public datasets. Not because they are threats, and not because someone wishes to bury them, but because our maps reflect consensus, not curiosity. And consensus prefers stability. Imagine a satellite sweeping across the Earth. It observes a cluster of readings that differ subtly from expectation, a gravitational fluctuation, an electromagnetic shadow, a distortion of timing signals. The raw data acknowledges the anomaly. But as it filters upward through layers of interpretation, formatting, and relevance, the irregularity grows quieter. It is flagged, studied, perhaps set aside for further review. And in that quiet shelving, the anomaly becomes a ghost note in the symphony of global information, still present but rarely played aloud. There is a kind of mercy in this omission. Maps, after all, serve a practical purpose. They are tools for navigation, commerce, safety. Marking every uncertainty, every unresolved phenomenon, every boundary that behaves incorrectly might do more harm than good. A driver does not need to know that gravity wavers on a remote mountain road. A farmer does not need to know that time ticks slightly differently beneath a canopy of northern pines, but researchers know. And archivists know, and somewhere, in rooms without windows, shelves hold binders, and servers hold files that quietly acknowledge the existence of outliers. Perhaps the greater question is not why these coordinates go missing, but what it means for a mystery to exist just outside the edges of public knowledge. There is precedent for this. Ancient maps often displayed sea serpents at the margins, not as monsters, but as symbols for here lies uncertainty. Later, unexplored territories were colored faintly, left blank or lightly sketched. The unknown was not denied, it was simply given space. Modern cartography has become less poetic. Blank spaces are rare. Certainty is the default, yet the unknown has not disappeared. It has simply migrated inward, into classified archives, restricted zones, encrypted research notes, into the quiet margins of our understanding. And this brings us to the human dimension of missing coordinates. Every person carries their own internal map, a sense of who they are, what they trust, where their boundaries lie. Some parts are clear and brightly marked. Others, though rarely acknowledged, remain undefined. Experiences that defy our expectations, emotions that shift without warning, memories that reorganize themselves with time. These are our personal anomalies, the internal equivalents of gravity hills and silent horizons. We rarely chart them openly. Instead, we tuck them into our own margins, not out of fear, but because we are still learning how to interpret them. The world, too, has such margins. Not places to fear, but places that remind us that knowledge is not a finished map, but an evolving one. That uncertainty does not invalidate our understanding. It enriches it. And as we approach the end of this journey, we turn toward one final reflection: the delicate partnership between science and story, and the quiet ways both shape our search for meaning. Science and storytelling are often portrayed as opposites, one grounded in rigor, the other in imagination. Yet when we look closely, we discover that both disciplines rest on a shared foundation, an agreement about how we make sense of the world. Science asks, what can be measured? Story asks, what does the measurement mean? And between them lies a quiet negotiation that shapes everything we believe to be true. Consider the anomalies we've explored: a hill where gravity seems to lean upward, a forest whose seconds stretch subtly longer, a chamber where quantum possibilities linger beyond expectation. Science approaches these places with instruments, equations, skepticism. Story approaches them with metaphor, reflection, intuition. And while these modes seem distinct, they actually depend on each other. Without story, scientific discovery loses context. Without science, story risks drifting untethered. Together, they offer a balanced view, one that acknowledges the unknown without leaping to unfounded conclusions. Every scientific paper carries within it a narrative structure, a beginning, the question, a conflict, the anomaly, an inquiry, the method, and a resolution, the interpretation. Likewise, every good story carries within it a scientific impulse, the desire to understand, to investigate, to articulate patterns in the world. The boundary between the two is thinner than we admit, sometimes no thicker than a sheet of tracing paper. In the case of these anomalous locations, the partnership becomes essential. For science alone cannot explain why the gravitational field buckles in certain remote regions, or why electromagnetic silence grips an outback plane, or why a chamber of engineered stillness allows quantum states to survive far longer than predicted. The instruments gather data. The equations test models. But beyond a certain threshold, a deeper question emerges. Not how does this work, but what does this suggest? This is where story enters gently, offering perspective without claiming certainty. Story reminds us that anomalies are not threats to knowledge, but invitations to expand it. They show that understanding is not a fortress built from rigid facts, but a living structure shaped by curiosity, humility, and imagination. There is also a quieter, more human agreement at play. Scientists, like storytellers, must decide which mysteries warrant attention. They choose where to look, what to measure, what to publish, and what to leave resting on the margins, not as acts of concealment, but as acts of stewardship. Knowledge grows not only by discovering new truths, but by understanding when to hold space for truths not yet ready to be expressed. And audiences, whether in a lecture hall or listening to a documentary, enter their own agreement. To remain open to wonder without surrendering to speculation, to grapple with uncertainty without filling it prematurely with answers. This shared responsibility is what allows the search for understanding to continue across generations. Think of the road that slopes upward, the forest that stretches time, the chamber where light hesitates. These places are not simply data points. They are invitations to contemplate the architecture of existence. They remind us that even the laws we consider most unyielding may carry subtleties we have not yet learned to trace. And they invite us to look inward, to consider our own assumptions, our own constants, our own shifting boundaries. In this light, the anomalies are not really about physics at all. They are about the human hunger for coherence, the desire to weave our scattered observations into a meaningful whole. They show that we are not merely passive observers of the universe, but active participants in interpreting it. As we prepare to step into the final chapter of this journey, we carry with us not just data, but perspective, a recognition that truth is not a single destination, but a path shaped by both inquiry and imagination. Ahead lies the epilogue, where the threads converge into a final reflection, not an answer, but a question that endures. In the end, our journey through these unusual landscapes leads us back to a familiar truth. The world is stranger, softer, and more intricate than our daily routines allow us to remember. We began with a simple premise, that the laws of nature are universal, fixed, dependable, and found ourselves wandering through places where gravity hesitates, where time breathes differently, where direction folds inward, and where matter conducts itself with unexpected grace. Each anomaly whispered a quiet counterpoint to certainty, not in defiance, but in invitation. Because the universe has always been a teacher of nuance. It reveals itself in layers, one for everyday life, one for careful study, and a deeper one that emerges only when conditions, environmental or emotional, allow. The anomalies we explored are not evidence that physics is broken. They are evidence that physics, like every human attempt at understanding, is incomplete. And incompleteness is not a flaw. It is a doorway. The mountain road that slopes upward reminds us that perspective shapes our experience of reality. The forest where time slows reminds us that our seconds are not uniform, even in memory. The silent horizon shows how dependent we are on invisible connections, and how revealing it can be when they disappear. The inward-pointing compass invites us to reconsider how we navigate a world that does not always give us fixed points. The chamber of changing weight suggests that burdens shift depending on where we stand. The desert where effects arrive, first, destabilizes our assumptions about causality, but also mirrors the moments in life when consequences seem to precede decisions. The room where light bends its own rules shows us that even the fastest truths may depend on direction. The quantum void reveals the beauty of the unchosen, the way multiple possibilities can coexist before resolving into form. And the laboratory of rising order, along with the field of shifting constants, reminds us that the universe may contain more flexibility than our equations express. Perhaps reality is less a rigid mechanism and more a living tapestry, one that occasionally adapts its weave. In all of these places, the anomalies serve not as warnings, but as mirrors. They reflect our own uncertainties, our own transitions, our own unsteady boundaries. They show that we, too, contain regions where time moves differently, where direction wavers, where the weight of experience grows heavier or lighter depending on our emotional altitude. They show that even our most trusted constants, beliefs, identities, relationships, shift gently over the course of a life. In this sense, the world's anomalies are not alien. They are profoundly human. The scientist in the laboratory, the traveler on the mountain road, the person listening to these stories all share the same quiet realization. Understanding is not a possession, but a practice. We learn, we revise, we reconsider, we grow. Knowledge is less a map and more a compass, one that occasionally spins, not to mislead us, but to remind us that discovery is ongoing. And so we return to the opening question, where do the laws of nature begin and where do they end? Perhaps they do not end at all. Perhaps they broaden. Perhaps the universe is still writing them, adjusting its constants, refining its rhythms, exploring its own potential. And perhaps our role is not to insist on final answers, but to participate in the unfolding, to observe carefully, to imagine responsibly, and to remain humble in the face of a cosmos that continues to surprise us. As we close this narrative, nothing has been solved in the conventional sense, but something has shifted. We have learned to see mystery not as an intrusion, but as a companion, one that walks alongside us, reminding us that wonder is not a childish impulse, but a profoundly human one. If reality can bend, even slightly, even locally, then understanding is not a destination, but a horizon, always ahead, always beckoning, always evolving. And perhaps that is the greatest truth of all.